Welcome to the PolyPsych podcast. This is your host, Anthony Lindsay.
And Stephanie Marino.
We're here with Kristen Huyett at Ohio State University, not West Virginia University.
That would be ridiculous.
Was in my notes before. Stephanie.
Kristen, it's nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you guys as well.
Thanks. So we'll just jump right in. I'm excited to talk to you about neurodiversity. There seems to be more public interest than in decades past in understanding people whose brains function in many different ways. What is some of the history behind the neurodiversity movement, how and why it got started, and has been picking up momentum?
Well, neurodiversity is typically a term that is normally used by folks in the autism world, but neurodiversity is just the infinite variation in neurocognitive functioning. So it's something that includes all of us, even neurotypicals, and all aspects of how the brain functions. It also includes different brain types like Asperger's and ADHD. And part of what we're trying to do is just spread awareness of the fact that we all have a brain, and we need to create a more neurodiverse friendly world. So just to start having more conversations about that and what that, really entails and includes.
Can you clarify what you meant by like the different strengths and maybe challenges that neurodivergent people possess and experience? As many of us are just simply not aware.
Right. So I was talking with someone last week who was diagnosed with Asperger's, and one of the main challenges that he faces is understanding social norms and social cues. And it's not that he gets misunderstood a lot as being rude or disrespectful, just because he doesn't pick them up and process them the same way as like a neurotypical would. And so if people don't know about neurodiversity, or if his teachers don't know that he has that diagnosis, he can really just get himself into a pickle, because even learning and understanding tones of voices and learning like when do you use a certain tone of voice versus another one is just something that like he can do. He can ultimately have a similar outcome as anyone, but he needs to talk about it. He's like, if someone would have just offered me a social coach back in like 5th grade, that would have made a world of difference. It's not that he didn't want to learn those things. He just didn't pick them up in the same way that the most of us would.
Okay. Is that a thing, a social coach?
I don't know if it's a thing, but
Should
him
be.
and I were talking about it, and we were talking about how if it's not a thing, we need to make it a
Absolutely.
thing.
I was just wondering. That sounds awesome.
Yeah, and also even just, I was just looking into the other day, there's a company called Affectiva, I believe is how you pronounce it, and they're doing a lot of work in how technology and artificial intelligence can read emotion, and how that might be able to also help folks on the spectrum learn like facial cues and tones of voices and stuff as well. So there's some interesting possibilities there for, that kind of technology.
So your project, let's talk about the story of Shapes. It sounds truly inspired as a way of not only generating awareness, but also providing a support zone for anyone driven by the cause. What kind of workshops and training programs are you working to build, and how are you coming about those methods as most effective in your opinion?
Well, so the story of Shapes is just getting started. We are building the website right now. The two main goals of that project are, one, to offer alternative spaces for neurodivergent folks to learn about their strengths and, projects that are oriented specifically for them. So, for instance, so I can hyperfocus really well, but hyperfocus, it takes, maybe 20, 30 minutes to get into that flow. And when you're there, you can stay there for a really long time. So having an hour-long math class doesn't necessarily work to my advantage. I might want to spend 3 hours on math. And so giving these students the opportunity to, use something that comes naturally to them, like or hyperfocus. So maybe it's like a Saturday workshop, and they come in and they spend a lot of time on one thing. So just, it's the same thing. It's ultimately achieving the same outcome. It's just done with a different structure in an environment that understands them. And then, of course, the other component is just raising awareness, doing talks like this, or we started a neurodiversity club on campus at OSU, because another big thing is that because our diagnoses are seen as taboo still, we are kind of essentially kind of boils down to feeling like you have to hide a huge part of who you are. And so since it's an invisible aspect of who you are, you tend not to meet other people like yourself. And I've met a lot of individuals who become adults, and that includes myself. I didn't really meet other neurodivergent folks until I was in my mid-20s. And so that creates isolation and loneliness. And so it also is trying to build just a community so that you have that support from people who are like yourself.
So there was a documentary on Netflix that was on people with autism, and one of the takeaways from it was that they didn't know like how to approach people with autism. Like their parents didn't know how to teach them. Their teachers didn't know how to teach them. Their friends didn't know how to interact with them, and they grow up, and eventually they kind of figure out their own autism, and they're able to kind of fit in, but the way they see the world is completely different. What would you suggest in order to kind of incorporate them at an earlier age into, I don't know, everything else, like our education, just in society in general?
Oh, that's a great question, and I'm glad you asked that. So, two things. The other thing I should say too is that neurodivergent individuals and students, they need training about themselves and to be able to, build their strengths and have their own identity. But neurotypicals, all of us also need training because we need to be able to understand these folks that we go to school with. And so that's like another thing I would love to go into grade schools and have a workshop there and teach whole classes to understand their peers better. So that needs to happen as well. And then the other thing too is like that. So I have gone to different elementary schools, and one of the things that I've noticed is that the kids are separated from the rest of the school a lot of times in these special ed classrooms. And these classrooms are doing great work, but at lunchtime, the kids go and they sit in the cafeteria by themselves. And it really kind of boils down to what you were saying, is that none of the other kids in the school have training on, why this kid, maybe interacts differently socially. And so giving the rest of the school a training to understand them better, giving the neurodivergent folks opportunities to interact with everybody else would be huge. Even just like little things like lunchtime, I think would go a long way.
That's a great point.
I wonder if, so I'm doing a project right now with Professor Beth Whitaker at the University of North Carolina, Charlotte, in which we examine like social capital and its effect on immigration opinion. And I know it may seem tertiary, but we're finding that people with lower social capital, people who don't have a social network, who don't have more connections with people outside of their group, and they have a loose connection even with people inside of their group, that these people, like it affects a lot of their opinions, a lot of the way they think. Do you think that people with autism, especially during childhood and during their most formative years, by not having a social network, could it exacerbate the issue? Could their autism get worse by simply not having people around them that understand them?
Absolutely. I mean, and that goes for ADHD, Asperger's, and autism. And even for myself, like, because I didn't understand my identity and because I didn't understand my strengths and weaknesses and how to work with those. I'm 32 and I'm finishing college. I'm graduating this May, and that has that is largely because I didn't have the right support when I was a kid, and that impacted my life financially as well, obviously, because I took a lot longer to get through. Not having even close friendships. I connect best with other folks who think like me on an emotional level. I don't, totally know why that is, but it is the case. And so, it impacts all aspects of your life. And then when it comes to getting a job, if you haven't, learned certain social cues, or you don't have that larger network, who are you going to network with? How are you going to interact with them socially? It's impacting, all of it. It's a great question.
So there are new findings that that individuals with an ASD diagnosis are more susceptible to other medical and psychiatric disorders ranging from insomnia to diabetes to depression and suicide. I feel like there is a misconception as to the reason, with some thinking that it's because of the disorder itself. How much would you say these other diagnoses are associated or even triggered by the social isolation experienced by those with an ASD?
So I will say thinking differently, having a different brain type is its own thing. And then a lot of times those comorbidities like depression, like anxiety, are coming in because you don't have a social network, and you don't have that kind of support. Now, can somebody with a different brain type also have a comorbidity, have depression or some other condition? Sure, of course. Like, they're a human being. Like, we're holistic beings. You can have multiple things in your life, but your brain type is its own thing. And then, like, for me, having depression and anxiety in my life was because I was, teachers were very dismissive. I was criticized at school, not understood. And so I always felt bad about that, not realizing that it wasn't, my problem, that it was just a misunderstanding, that I wasn't having the right support that I needed. I didn't know other people like me. And so that all just got out of control, and the depression and the anxiety built. And, it's at a certain point, and this happens to a lot of individuals, if you aren't understood by people in your life, to protect yourself, you isolate. And then that further worsens the situation.
Yeah.
So it can be, I guess, both in general, but it's certainly, it's those environmental, social factors that can make those situations worse.
So, all right. So last question, and then I'll let you go. How do you fix this problem for children, especially with ASD?
Well, I think that it starts with awareness and education, both for neurodivergence as well as neurotypicals, having those conversations and getting people to kind of see, what are our similarities, even though you seem different than me, what do we have in common? Helping people to understand, if someone doesn't make eye contact with you, that doesn't mean they're not listening. Just little things like that is, a really, I think, probably the best first start. Just goes back to conversations and community. Just interact with your peer, that'll change a lot.
Yeah, getting out of your social bubble. I recognize that's a lot of the problem, especially in college, is that people stick with their own social and ideological bubble. And if they never break out of it, they can never really speak to the other side. And it's like we all stay in our own little world. And that can't be a good thing.
Right, exactly.
All right, Kristen, I really appreciate you speaking with us today. Again, it's Kristen Huyett at Ohio State University.
All right. Thank you so much, Kristen.
All right, well, thank you.
All
Cheers.
right.
Yeah, I think I was still calling it a mental disorder, but neurodiversity definitely sounds a lot better because they're not necessarily broken. When you think of disorder, it comes with the stigma of, and they may actually still call it a disorder in some circumstances, but when you think of disorder, it has that stigma of the person standing in the trench coat, screaming at the side of the building like that. But a person with autism, maybe they just don't like to speak to people, but they're perfectly functional.
Yeah, or have a hard time doing it. I think that it's less often that they don't like to, more so as their brain is not letting them navigate the interpersonal interactions like that. It's a good thing on one sense because medically there's more understanding about what's happening, and scientifically they're learning much more about autism and Asperger's and other neuro conditions, I guess. But on the other hand, it's a social problem because anything that's a pathology, quote unquote, is social. It's social taboo.